Okay, well, my name is Lyonette, and here we are in Sulpice in Switzerland. But what I'd like to talk about this morning are a few examples in practical terms of how sustainable development based on people, dignity and value have taken place and are of a kind that could be replicated if people understand what values are needed. And we're going to talk about three countries: Cuba, Dominican Republic and Colombia. Let's begin with Cuba because of its peculiarity, a so-called communist government, post-communism development. The way I got involved, and my wife and I got involved in this, was that the Cuban Council of Churches, which is the Protestant group, asked us to advise them on how to change their devotional activities. As they said, we're on our knees in church, but we need to get off our knees and get into the streets to help people. And it was our first role to advise them how they could do that. And one of the projects that was chosen by them, not by us, to see if an integrated approach to development could be carried out, was in a place very near Havana called Boca de Jaruca. And what had happened there, the Jaruca was what they called a national tourism beach. So it wasn't open to international mass tourism, it was for Cubans. And all of a sudden, oil appeared under the beach. Not just oil, but oil that was very heavy in sulfuric content, and it was accompanied by huge amounts of methane gas. Now, what were the problems caused by this? Immediately, there was a huge increase in bronchial infections because the air was polluted. Secondly, tourism collapsed. Nobody was going to go to a beach that was dirty with methane floating around. And with the Cuban Council of Churches and their local representatives, and the important thing to notice is they were local, we worked out a plan which the Ministry of Energy completely endorsed and indeed supported. And in very broad terms, brief terms, what happened was this. First of all, the oil was obviously caught in barrels. It was extremely useful because Cuba at that time, and still is, under an economic embargo, and therefore any oil that was available was worth its weight in gold. Secondly, the sulfur, which is a big problem in oil extraction. The Cubans extracted the sulfur and they used it in their very well-known biomedical program. And we can even put a price on that. The sulfur coming out of the ground at the beginning with the oil was worth $250,000 per year to the biomedical program. But the big thing was methane. What could you do with it? It was a type of methane, thank goodness, that could be used in gas supply to houses for domestic use. And in that area of Boca de Jaruca, there were about 25,000 families. They had connections to a gas supply that was intermittent, defective. The connections were in rusted metal. There was a danger of explosion and accidents. Those connections were replaced with plastic, because methane does not rot plastic. And 25,000 people had access to a safe supply of domestic gas. Now, it wasn't given free. They paid for it, and they were happy to pay for it. They didn't have much money to pay, but they paid what they could. And that wasn't the only thing we did with methane. For example, the children in this area had no transport. They couldn't get to school. It was too far to walk. So buses were converted to the use of methane instead of gasoline. They then became the school buses, and the kids went back to school regularly in a dependable way. Equally, while the buses were not used for school purposes, they were used as emergency vehicles, ambulances, firefighting, whatever. And these were fed with methane, which the local council or municipal council used for the provision of decent public services. Let me just add here that this was quite a long time ago when it was done, but personally I paid a surprise visit to Jaruca some 4 years ago. They didn't know I was coming. I took a taxi from Havana, and not only is the project working extremely well, they've even found a new use for methane, and they have a taxi service with methane owned and operated by the local municipality, the revenue of which goes into public services. Now, I mean, to my mind, that is a fairly good example of what can be done if people think clearly and comprehensively. There was a problem for people. How do you solve it? You involve the people. You don't come in with a magic external solution. And here in Jaruca, we had the Council of Churches, very important, very influential. And they broadened their thinking into sustainable development. Even the Ministry of Energy, which, as I'm sure you all know, in a communist society is very rigid bureaucracy, they broadened, they expanded, they became more flexible, and they helped out. So that's one example. Let's talk now about the Dominican Republic. And here, this is an example on a slightly larger scale than the Cuban one. What you had at the time this sustainable development process was begun was a province which was in opposition to the very authoritarian central government in Santo Domingo. The senators were of the opposition. The reaction of the central government to this was to cut off all financial assistance and investment into this province. And that obviously was quite serious. The leading senator, Jaime David Fernandez, thought the best way of doing this was not to fight it in the capital, where the government was all powerful, but to begin a process of consultation at provincial level involving everybody possible to define what they needed and what was possible to obtain within the circumstances they were living in. And this provincial process, one talks about participation, and quite often participation becomes a very limited exercise when it shouldn't be. This provincial process was really comprehensive. You had the campesinos, the peasants, the agricultural workers, the professionals, the chambers of commerce, the tradespeople, the church, the military, even though the military were under command from the capital, and trade unions. And they all literally sat down and said, what is our situation? What is possible to do to improve it? And what do we want? And in this process, they therefore defined a development program for their own province. And what happened was that then there were national elections shortly thereafter, and in fact, the opposition won. Now here then was a province ready to go. And it is absolutely remarkable what this province, which was called Salcedo, has achieved on the basis of this development program defined by themselves, for themselves, in a totally open participatory process, where people and community were given the value they should have. One minor example, or one smaller example within the Dominican Republic, was a slum clearance project in in the capital Salcedo itself. What we did as a test was to ask an international development agency to look at the situation and give us a plan and a budget for doing a slum clearance and rehabilitation program. They came up with a figure of $600,000, which, okay, in development terms, is not all that much. What we did, however, and not we, again, it was local people. I had the privilege of being with them, with a community approach involving the women, the children, the men, putting in their own work, putting in their own thinking, putting in their own planning. To cut a long story short, we achieved the slum clearance, including the establishment, for example, of vegetable gardens on what was previously a slum riverbank. We achieved it for $75,000. Finally, let me mention Colombia, which is, I always find it very amusing and a kind of happy example. The German Development Corporation had a decentralization program. Very good idea, devolving democracy, involving local people in definition of their own future. They'd gone through the normal process, devolution of funding from the capital to the community, the municipality. They went through a participatory assembly process where everyone who wanted to came together. They were told, we have X amount of money. how are we going to use it? What are our priorities? And that process, I must admit, worked fairly well. But it tended to be subject to kind of certain domination by local powerful interests. Now the next step, excuse me, was to put that budget onto the software program of implementation by the municipal authorities and administration. But there was an addition to the software, and this was a very interesting program devised by a Colombian software company, whereby if at any point somebody tried to exceed the agreed budget allocation, whether in terms of putting more money into something that shouldn't have it, or taking money out to use it somewhere else, if anything of that kind happened, the whole system blocked. And nothing could be done. Red lights flashed, bells rang, and the workstation where the kind of attempt at corruption, if you want to call it, had taken place, identified itself. And then whoever was responsible, this was made public in the community. And that was a highly effective control. It happened, I think, 2 or 3 times, and after that, the shame that came from public disclosure stopped it happening again. Now, I talked with the community on a number of occasions, and one remarkable impact that this nice little software program had was to bring the women into administration and local democracy. They told me quite bluntly, yes, we followed the participatory assembly, we followed the budget, but we knew somebody was going to mess it up. With this software, we trust it now. We know that if somebody tries to mess it up, we will know who and when and how, and we can stop it. The remarkable thing then was, 1 year later, with the municipal councillor elections, 40% of those elected were women. And that, to me, added the final touch of real local democracy and participation. Okay, we've talked about 3, maybe 4 examples. What does it teach us? What are the messages that come through? First of all, there's no magic external solution. Scientists are very useful, but they don't have all the answers. Sustainable development is about people and giving them the choices, the value, the dignity that they deserve. So community, people, recognition of value, and an integrated approach that does not overemphasize, let's say, private sector development or economic growth per se. It's a reconciliation of the valid values of people, natural resources, and an economy that is good for people as such. So I hope those few ideas are interesting, think about them, you can pull the lessons out and use them in other places. Is that okay?